The final report of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes was published on the 11th of January 2021, almost 6 years after its establishment in 2015. The publication of the report was preceded by a leak of its main provisions to a Sunday newspaper before it was to be launched. Survivors had been promised a short period of time to scrutinise it before publication and were naturally upset and distressed by the leak. An inquiry into the leak was ordered by the government. So far, there is no result from that inquiry. And the man in charge of it, Martin Fraser, Secretary General of the Department of the Taoiseach, is now packing his bags to go off and be our ambassador to London. So where is he going to get time to conclude this very important investigation? I don't think we're ever going to get an answer to it. There was extensive media coverage of the report in the weeks following its publication, with survivors, advocates groups, journalists and commentators scrambling to read almost 3,000 pages. Very quickly, two issues became contentious. First, some of the report's findings, and they were: the Commission found no evidence of physical abuse in the institutions. The Commission found no evidence of forced adoptions. The Commission believes society at large and the children's fathers and their families to be responsible for the harsh treatment of women and children in these institutions, with church and state merely backing them up. And the second issue of contention was the treatment of survivors' testimony in the report. The Commission chose, unlike the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse, the Ryan Commission, not to hold a press conference to launch the report and not to make themselves available to answer the many questions to which the survivors, their advocates and the media sought answers. Their silence was difficult to understand and appeared contemptuous of people whom they might have expected to be extremely upset by their findings and treatment of their testimony. Joe Duffy's Liveline radio programme ran survivor stories for 2 weeks following the publication of the report. Some were people who had already shared their stories, but many were speaking publicly for the first time. And their accounts of their experiences in the homes and ongoing obstruction from church and state to access to their identity records were riveting and sad to hear. Many also complained of their treatment by the Commission, both at their meetings with them and in the report. The Commission's report has many deficiencies, but perhaps the most serious of these is the absence of survivors' voices from its pages. These are the people whose ill-treatment, suffering and dogged advocacy led to the establishment of the Commission in 2015 in the first place, and who had reasons to expect that its findings would be based largely on their testimonies, along with the records of church and state which have been kept from them for many years. Their voices, their experiences and their opinions should have played a central part in this report, but they do not. Many also felt that the Commission should have expanded its terms of reference to include proper investigation of children born in the homes who were adopted, fostered, boarded out, or sent to industrial schools. A large number of those who gave testimony to the Commission had experienced these outcomes, excuse me, coupled with serious obstruction when they attempted to obtain their identity information. At least the Commission, while failing to investigate these practices, did recommend that, quote, adopted people should have a right to their birth certificates and associated birth information. A person's right to his or her identity is an important human right and should only be denied in very exceptional circumstances. Medical information and adoption records compiled at the time of the adoption should also be available. That recommendation has translated into a new bill on adoption and tracing, which will hopefully, but not definitively, guarantee for the first time citizens' right to their own identity information, long overdue. Some speed in its passage would be welcome. I often say there's a sign hanging over this country which you sometimes might think it's half a moon in a black sky. It's half a bottom in a black sky. Let's not do the thing properly if we can possibly manage it. We were promised this bill months and months ago, particularly in the fury after the reception of the report. And at the moment, there's no sign of it. Also, some of our guests here today are going to have serious things to say about the flaws in that bill. The public response to the report was complicated by two separate aspects of its contents: the horrific child mortality figures, stories of neglect and abuse in the homes, the constant theme of mothers losing their children, and the seemingly contradictory conclusions reached by the Commission, combined with their evident disregard for survivor testimony. On the one hand, people were grateful to the Commission for revealing the scale and detail of abuses within the homes. On the other, completely puzzled by their conclusions, which didn't seem to follow from that information. There were public apologies from the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, and the Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. What a mouthful. And from some of the religious congregations who ran the homes. But the shock, hurt and anger of survivors only increased as they contemplated the dismissive way the Commission had treated their testimony. and the bizarre conclusions reached by them which directly contradicted much of that testimony. Over a few months, a loose coalition of survivors, advocates groups like the Clann Project and the Adoption Rights Alliance, lawyers, journalists, and other public commentators emerged to criticise the report and, in many cases, to call for its repudiation by the government. That coalition is still intact, and its various moving parts have helped to keep the Commission's report in the public eye. Now, this didn't really happen after the report on industrial schools, the Ryan report, or the very, very flawed report on Magdalen Laundries, the McAleese report. But in this case, there's been a combination of a lot of vocal people, particularly brave and courageous survivors who have come forward to tell their own stories, but with a lot of backup from the kinds of people we're seeing here on the platform today. So these people are Noelle Brown, who all of you will know from her many media appearances, playwright, actress, survivor of Bessborough Mother and Baby Home, and passionate advocate for survivors' rights. She was one of the first people to come out publicly against the report the day after its publication. It wasn't that she could read 3,000 pages in a day. She had other kinds of information that were very germane to the ongoing discussion on it. She's been unrelenting since in her dogged attempts to get her own identity and health information, and in doing so, to open the door for others. Her play, Postscript, is a wonderful evocation of the search in which she has been involved for decades. And if any of you, it has had many iterations. There may be some hope of a film of it at some stage, and I really commend it to you. It's an absolutely wonderful piece of dramatic art, as well as the telling of an extraordinary story. Conall O'Fatharta, over here on my right, has been writing about mother and baby homes for a very long time. 15 years, I would estimate. Am I right, or is it more?
12.
12, okay. I'm just over-egging the pudding a little. You deserve it. In the Examiner, which I still sometimes call the Cork Examiner, which of course is dreadful. It's like calling the Guardian, the Manchester Guardian. That's all over. But Conall was one of the first people to come out. Sorry, where are we now? He was demonstrating the enormous difficulties very often in his pieces with getting relevant information from church and state, and he gave voice to many survivors whose stories otherwise would not have been heard. He is now, hooray, a PhD candidate and a lecturer in this very university. So he's a loss to journalism, but again to academia and to the many students who can learn from him how proper evidential investigative journalism should be carried out. And of course, one of the crucial things about Conall's journalism, as I mentioned, was that he gave voice to survivors. Survivors' voices are at the very kernel of this whole dispute that's going on about the report itself. Maeve O'Rourke, human rights lawyer and co-founder of the Clann Project, and also a member of the staff at this august university. The Clann Project is an extremely effective advocacy organisation for survivors. Maeve has become a familiar face and voice nationally from her numerous appearances on various media. She doggedly insisted that GDPR, the European Data Protection Regulation, which up to now everyone has abhorred and hated because it's such a nuisance, suddenly turns out to be our saviour because it guarantees citizens' rights to their own identity. Finally, the Attorney General agreed that she was correct in this matter, which is fantastic. The learned Attorney General, who never has to give reasons for anything he says, really bizarre actually in a democracy, actually did listen to the great Maeve O'Rourke, take on board what she had to say, and that is now supposed to inform the adoption and tracing bill, but she's going to be telling us more about that when we get on, as she has many things to say about how this can be enshrined in law and implemented. And lastly, Caelainn Hogan's Republic of Shame is a work of impeccable research, considerable empathy, and beautiful writing on the history of Irish carceral institutions, combined with many interviews with survivors, relatives, and authority figures connected with those institutions. It's an absolutely wonderful book. It's packed with empathy, but it's also nuanced, complicated. She has interviews, for example, with some nuns who ran these homes, who are evasive, but it's interesting to hear what they have to say, as it is everybody's voice that comes into this book. I really recommend it to you. I presume it's for sale in the local bookstore in town. I hope it is. But if it is, grab it up and read it. And it's strangely not a depressing book. There's something incredibly uplifting about the courage of all of these people in the face of what they suffered. And Kelan continues to write commentary on the subject and to advocate for survivors. So now I am going to sit down and let these wonderful people talk to us. So, Noelle, I'm going to start with you. What's it been like as a survivor to deal with the months since the report's publication, and what have you managed or not managed to extract from the authorities since then in relation to your own case?
It's been extremely emotionally challenging for me and for many, many survivors. I think not only, like the emotional fallout from the report was colossal. And I think that cannot be underestimated, particularly by the fact that there's no services out there for people that were affected by what happened. The careless taking of those testimonies, taking them out of context, cut and pasting them badly. The long-term effect of that, particularly on people who had the courage to go in there and share very, very difficult personal stories, cannot be underestimated. And I am calling on the government right now to make sure that there are services in place for those people, particularly in Cork. There's the post-adoption service, who are inundated. The fact that Besborough was in that report, it has kicked off an enormous amount of emotional need in Cork from survivors, and there is no services, qualified people to help. That is fundamental. I think also the lack of accountability for what happened with the report, what happened with the testimonies, just what you listed there, no evidence of, all of those things. But the contaminated evidence was words that were used continually, which was really upsetting for survivors. But the lack of accountability and the arrogance around the people who were part of that commission and drew up this report and then shut down and took no responsibility for the devastation they caused is deeply upsetting. And I think there's a carelessness around it. I got an email from the Department of Children saying, "Oh, but we believe you, we believe you." And it was like, well, if you believe us, then believe that this report is an absolute disgrace and is deeply offensive to survivors, to people who have been through so much in their lives. And that lack of accountability and the arrogance around not appearing before the Oireachtas to talk about this report, to really apologise for the level of hurt that it caused, was deeply upsetting for people. On the back of that, we were told, apply for do a subject access request to get all the documentation that the Commission had on you. That they disappeared, so then the Department of Children, they took that on. So I did a subject access request to get all the documentation that the Commission had on me. And what came back to me was pages and pages of redacted documents, more redacted than even TUSLA could do, and they do a great job of it, believe me. I also got the only thing that was useful was the recording of the time I sat talking to the Commission of Investigation. That was useful. It was upsetting because I heard how open I was with them, how much I shared with them, and how many times I asked for them to investigate whether I was the subject of vaccine trials or not, which they refused. What came out of that was a letter to say that they were withholding my health data, which is code for you were the subject of vaccine trials, which I've always assumed. And there are many, many other survivors out there like that. And the way they're withholding this data after 55 years on this earth is that they're saying you can have this data if you nominate a GP who we will go to and talk to, and then we will decide, the GP will decide if your mental health is able to cope with getting that information or not. I mean, the absolute stigmatizing and infantilizing of us by the Department of Children. I don't know why they are dealing with us, to be quite honest. We're very clearly not children. I'm 55 years old. So that's what we're dealing with. I refuse to do that. I'm going into litigation now to get that health data. But that is important information for me. And to be denied it by some faceless civil servant who has access to that information and say, well, we'll talk to a GP about you. The department has never worried about our mental health, ever.
No.
I've had nearly 20 years of searching for my identity, for basic information, like so many survivors. Nobody ever cared about our mental health. Nobody cared about our mental health in the fallout from the Commission of Investigation report. Serious emotional damage for people. They didn't care. So what's going on? It just gets worse and worse and worse. There's total inaction around it. I'm terrified that that report will stand as a history of the 76 years of history of this country, that those voices that are in there, the lived experiences, have been destroyed. So to me, the heart of that report were those testimonies, and they were handled so badly. But that's where we are. It is wonderful to be here today in such esteemed company, but I wish it wasn't necessary. I wish I was sitting here talking about something else. I can't believe that I'm still talking about it. And the play you mentioned was written in 2013, postscript. It's still relevant. Every single word of it is still relevant. And I think that's really, really sad. We're at a very crucial time. We have public support. We have, you know, the lawyers supporting us. We have journalists supporting us. We have advocates. We have the public. We're at a very crucial time in our history. And I really hope that something happens and that the delay, deny tactics cease, because it is deeply disturbing that people are dying without justice. And we have to face the fact that there are 9,000 infants dead in the hands of the state, and nobody's accountable for that. And there are mass graves across Ireland that haven't been dealt with. So I at the moment, I don't know, my anger seems to increase year by year, and I worry about being articulate enough, you know, that the anger just stops all of that. I hope not. But I have to just say that we are at a very crucial point, and we need the support to make this happen. We're not being listened to, and it's time that we were finally listened to.
Noelle, I mean, there's no one as eloquent as you on this subject. And I think it's, I mean, we've become friends over the last while because you gave me enormous help with the piece I wrote for the Dublin Review about the report. But I've seen the toll it's taken on you dealing with all of this. As you say, you wish to God you didn't have to be doing this. Yeah. People were expecting this report to finally lay everything to rest. We would get the full story of how people were treated, proper recommendations, proper conclusions about what this meant as a huge and momentous part of Irish history. And we got the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. And the shock of that, let alone the outrage at the actual findings, is still reverberating among survivors. And I've seen it in you, that you're exhausted a lot of the time. Yeah. Now you're much better now than you were at the start. But this is not fair, that you should have to keep going with this.
And I'm not alone.
For as long as this. You're not alone.
Not alone.
And I suppose that the one bright point in all of this is precisely that so many survivors, inspired, many of them by yourself, have come forward now to tell their stories in public for the first time, driven by shock, dismay and outrage at what that report has done. But thank you for your ongoing efforts. It's so important that your voice is heard, and it is being heard. Conall, just turning to you next. Tell us a little about what it's been like to cover this subject for the last 12 years. I think one of the things you've said to me from time to time is that it was difficult to maintain public interest in the subject. It became sometimes slightly niche, as it were, hard maybe to convince your editors to keep exploring it. Maybe talk to us about that a bit.
Yeah, like I think initially, so I started writing about it I started researching it in 2009, and I think the first story of, I suppose, of significance that grabbed the public attention was in 2010, which was I wrote about Tressa Reeves. So she's an English lady, her parents were Irish, and she became pregnant in the 70s and was sent to Dublin to have the child in secret, and the child was illegally adopted through St. Patrick's Guild. The child was falsely registered in the name of the adoptive parents, which obviously became a major issue to the department in 2018, despite the fact, you know, we've known about it for a long, long time, and people were writing about it before me as well. That was the first story that kind of got any kind of sense of traction, but as often happens in the media, it gets 2 days of coverage and then it fades away. So I suppose I was quite young when I started writing that story. I just kind of fell into it almost, and when I met Tressa in England, I suppose I kind of knew then I was going to be writing about it for a while, or a long time. I probably didn't know how complex it was going to be and how deep and wide the story would become, but I had an idea that what happened to her, she was unlikely to be alone, and judging by the records, it was clear that St. Patrick's Guild were openly admitting that they had done this to her and to another child adopted is the wrong word, or given to the family that her son was reared in. So I suppose when I came back from that, I increasingly started to focus on the systemic nature of it and trying to access records and things like that. I think I did get a lot of support in the Examiner, in the sense of if I had a story, they'd run it, and I did a lot of the work kind of on my own time a little bit, because I was a daily reporter, so I was expected to write daily news as well. And a lot of the longer term in-depth stuff I would do kind of off my own time and at weekends and stuff like that. But I became, anyone who knows me, I'm a fairly obsessive type of character. So I get very into any subject that I'm interested in. So this certainly became the sole, it was certainly a joke in the newsroom that I was a one-story journalist, which is fine by me. So it wasn't difficult to write about. I always found it kind of an honor to write about. I'm still very close with Tressa. She's a very important person in my life because I think my career, who I am as a person, all of that really stemmed from my mid-early 20s writing about this. It's become the focus of what I do. In terms of accessing information, I think that's became more and more difficult post the revelations at Tuam and the work of Catherine Corliss. It was interesting how the state certainly became far more aware that the records were what people were going to go after, and particularly me. So, for example, I was writing about the transfer of records from Bessborough, post the 2010 Adoption Act, the transfer of records from Bessborough from the hands of the religious to the state. And I mean, I was FOIing those records then, and I was getting access to material. You certainly might have a battle, but as we've learned in recent weeks, FOI is a interesting vehicle in Ireland.
Double-edged sword.
But certainly post the revelations at Tuam, it became nigh on impossible to access records via FOI. But then I started to get information that would have been leaked to me. But that took, it took a long time of writing about something before people, shall we say, on the state side of the fence started to, contact me and give me small snippets of information. But people spoke more. Like initially, adopted people would speak to you, but natural mothers found it very difficult to speak out. So Tressa did initially, but I think she was English, so she had a different cultural background to it. She never felt the same level of, she was frankly pissed off about it and was tired of having to bang on doors. So she she happened to meet me and I happened to write about it. But now we're in a whole different space, like we've discovered the level of public anger around this, including among people who have no connection to the issue, is what strikes me. So I think in a strange way, it's going to be easier for journalists to write about it. It's going to be easier to expose more and more because there is an audience for it. There's a public anger around it. And I think there's only so long you can sit on information and there's only so long you can sit on human rights abuse until it eventually always comes out. So, I suppose I just stuck at it.
It's really encouraging to hear that, Conall, and the work you've done has been hugely important over the last years. But what's needed, I suppose, is to keep the thing on the public agenda. And there are sort of milestones that come up from time to time, like the judicial review cases that are being taken by a number of survivors. I think Mary Harney is here with us today, a very courageous and famous survivor now. And she tells me that hers is coming up in November. That could be a very interesting moment in terms of another blast at the report. But I'm going to turn to our brilliant lawyer here now, Maeve O'Rourke, to fill us in on what exactly the legal situation is now with regard to people's right to access their identity records. And how might that be changed if the current adoption and tracing bill is passed as is without any changes? And also maybe to elaborate a little on the judicial review cases and what they're about so that people can understand what that is. It's a lot to ask.
I'll do my best.
I know you can do it, yeah.
Okay, so the current situation regarding your right to know who you are is that EU law, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is directly effective in Ireland and is supreme over anything else that would contradict it. So EU law is what rules. And even if the government was to bring in legislation that said something different that's incompatible with EU law is still in charge. So there's really no point in the government putting everyone through the misery of trying to legislate away EU data protection law. And this is something we've been trying to get across for so long. Under the GDPR, the definition of personal data is anything that relates to you, and then there's a long list of, in this way, that way, that way. And it includes information that relates to you and somebody else at the same time.
Yeah.
And that is the crucial issue that the government refuses to accept, because, of course, there are religious people, state officials, many different people, of course, the people's family members named on records that relate to them. And were you to start giving out mixed personal data, it would reveal a lot about what other people did in relation to you, about who you are related to. This is something we've been recommending that the state looks at the example of the Stasi Records Agency in Berlin, and that's the headquarters, but it extends digitally and in physical form all around the country. And the reason we're recommending looking at the German example is because it's within the EU, and because, therefore, you can see it is not contrary to the GDPR to give people all the information that relates to them, even when it also shows what their neighbours did to them, or what member of state civil service did to them. So that's the big issue that the government refuses to acknowledge. And one of the problems was that the Mother and Baby Homes Commission refused to acknowledge it as well. So GDPR came in 2018. I mean, even before that, of course, there are rights under the Irish Constitution, the European Convention on Human Rights, to respect for your private and family life, which includes your right to personal data. But anyway, let's just stick with post-2018. The Mother and Baby Homes Commission refused point blank to give anybody a transcript of their own evidence,
right,
your personal data, any information it was gathering in relation to you, anything about a deceased relative, which, again, many lawyers would argue is also your personal data because it relates to your family and your family history. And also, if a person is deceased, they don't have rights that conflict with yours. And it completely breached its obligations. The issue that I think people don't necessarily understand, but Noelle alluded to about challenging bad behaviour of a commission of investigation, is there were 15 things that you could have litigated in the morning about how that commission was operating, denying people fair procedures, breaching EU law. But the way the state operates in relation to so-called historical abuse is that no redress or apology or any kind of services come until the end of an inquiry. Therefore, many survivors that we met with, and we all met with lawyers, and we discussed many times judicially reviewing the Commission's procedures. But if you'd done that, you would have stopped that Commission for, 10 years? And who had the authority to stop something that so many thousands of people are relying on for the political reason that until it's done, nothing happens? And even the guards, we heard from Anna Corrigan, for example, give evidence to the Oireachtas Committee on Children in relation to the burials bill, saying she went to the guards and they said, oh no, we don't want to deal with your complaint, there's a commission ongoing. So when a commission is ongoing, it sucks up all the records and all the energy and all the actions. So it was really not an option to challenge its behaviour. And I mean, even in its findings, it actually says, we recommend adopted people should get to know who they are, but they don't have a right to know who they are now.
Well, I quoted at the start, and here I go again, just in case there's any confusion about it. This is a quote from the Commission's recommendations. Adopted people should have a right to their birth certificates and associated birth information. A person's right to his or her identity is an important human right and should only be denied in very exceptional circumstances. That's their loophole.
Should have a right. They have one right now.
Yeah. Well, it is, but it's interesting that I was surprised to see them articulating even that.
Yeah, I mean, GDPR wasn't mentioned. I did a word search for it. It's not in the Mother and Baby Homes Commission report. And they also say the religious orders have the right to control what they do with their data, their records or their property, and they have the right to decide who gets access to them. That is incorrect. Yeah. The religious orders are data controllers. We have recommended to the government. So then the government comes along and it also doesn't understand GDPR. Number one, it wanted to seal the entire archive gathered by the Mother and Baby Homes Commission. It cannot do that because you can't blanket seal personal data. We recommended that they fund a dedicated part of the Data Protection Commission that would deal really quickly with people's complaints, that would issue advisories to all the data controllers in the state. That's never been done. The Minister could issue a ministerial circular explaining what GDPR means and how all the data controllers in the state should operate. It has never been done. And now they've come along with the Birth Information and Tracing Bill that they're claiming is the best thing since sliced bread, because finally they're going to give everybody their name, although if your parent, either father or mother, says they don't want to be contacted, you'll be sat down with the social worker and explained, these people have privacy, nothing in the legislation about your rights at all. You need to understand what privacy means, you need to respect their privacy. Without the evidence that adopted people do not understand privacy, could not receive that information in written form, and need social workers of all people to sit them down.
Well, I think this is an absolute follow-on from what Noelle was telling us about patronising, infantilising
Absolutely.
Survivors as if they're small children rather than grown adults with very clear
and there's
objectives.
I'll be really quick, but there are some really, really important issues with that legislation as well, that you'll be entitled to your file, but not anything that relates to a parent's care of you or an adopted parent's care of you, and you will not be entitled to anything identifying about a sibling. And then the Section 40 of it just disapplies GDPR to the extent necessary to implement the bill, and actually it only says you can apply to either the Adoption Authority of Ireland or TUSLA for your information. So is it actually trying to do away with your right to apply to all of the others? Yeah. We saw GSK the other day come out, this is GlaxoSmithKline, with the press release, international press release. It was on the news at 1.
These were the people around the vaccine trials.
And they came out with, we are now offering people access to their personal data. I have a feel like GSK are going to do something that the government can't even bring itself to do. Will they give people their health data without this nonsense?
Well,
blanket rule.
Exactly.
It may well be that they're actually going to implement GDPR.
But is it not just what they have, what they gave to the Commission of Investigation, or is it their own documents? Because I wasn't clear about that. It's not, you know what I mean? They say what we gave to the Commission of Investigation, which is very sparse and has
very
serious gaps in it.
I suppose the point is that, okay, with Brexit, at the moment the data protection regime is the same. It may change in due course, but at the moment the data protection law, even in the UK, is the same as under GDPR. And the point is that, you know, that is actually the law, and everybody involved is going to have to start applying it. And I do think, unfortunately, our Data Protection Commission just, you know, could have been more
active. Is there any legal remedy against them disapplying GDPR for the purposes of this new bill?
I mean, it will lead to litigation, and that is the devastating thing. And even Noelle mentions litigation, Mary Harney now involved in a judicial review. It is unacceptable to put people through this when the law is so clear. Why did it take half the country to get involved in a campaign in October to not illegally seal the Mother and Baby Homes Commission archive? Apparently, the Attorney General only turned up after the legislation had gone through and came to Cabinet on a Tuesday and said,
you can't do that.
You can't seal the archive. And meanwhile, all of us who were advocating had been, our reputations dragged through the mud, defamed in the Shannon. These people are, you know, devastating survivors, willfully, deliberately upsetting people who've already been through so much. The law is clear.
Ironic, yeah?
Yeah, there's barely words to describe. Actually, it feels like things are getting worse, and all we can keep saying to the civil servants whenever we get to see them in the government is, like, those records are there and the truth will out, so you might as well give up the game now.
And sorry, just one thing to say. I had the department had a data breach. They shared an email from my solicitor, Simon McGar, to them about me, to a journalist, accidentally. They had a data breach and they didn't inform me of it. So this is the people that bang us over the head about data and privacy and all those things. And they do something like that. Accidentally send it to a journalist? I mean, what the hell? And these are the faceless civil servants, you know, the state agencies that have access to all this personal information. It's
at some point we'll get some insight into the mindset of those who are now charged with doing this kind of work. I mean, TUSLA, the department itself, some politicians. What is the general mindset that says, do everything possible to prevent people from getting the information they need, instead of the opposite, do everything possible to get them the information they need? You know, it's not that much of a stretch. And it's hard to figure out what the problem is, actually. You know, you've proven that GDPR is there. If they want to do it, they have a perfect excuse with that. Why do they not want to?
I think, I mean, objectively speaking, there is an issue, I think, in relation to the statute of limitations regarding personal injuries and constitutional rights violations in Ireland. If I mean, that statute has run a long time ago unless you didn't know the full details of what you experienced. And if you receive unredacted records, or if you meet your son, as Tressa Reeves did, and all of a sudden you've got information that you never knew, then you could argue that you have a right now to access court in a way that, you know, the alleged wrongdoers have always been insulated from before because of our very strict limitation period. And in England...
What is the limit on the statute of limitations?
2 years, 6 years, it depends on the time. But in England, the statute of limitations says a judge can disapply it in the interest of justice. And for example, people here may know of the Mau Mau litigation. A group of Kenyans tortured in the 1950s were able to get a settlement in 2012 because the High Court allowed their case to proceed because they had access to a huge state archive
which had been hidden
of documents which had been hidden.
Great scandals. Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is complicated in terms of the legal steps that Maeve and her colleagues are attempting to take with survivors and others to get information opened up. But basically, it's a simple matter. There are records there that belong to the church and the state, which have been kept closed and away from people who have a perfect right to see them in terms of their own well-being and the understanding of their identity. And there is no logical reason at this point why those records should not be opened up. Maeve, thank you. This is complicated stuff, I know, but it's wonderful that you're doing the work you are. Kelan, just to finish up with you from this round, your book, Republic of Shame, is a really extraordinary publication. And you put a great deal of energy into contacting all kinds of different people, survivors, relatives, authority figures from the homes as well. And it was a semi-memoir too, talking about your own upbringing, your own experiences, which worked really well, I thought, against the stuff you're doing. Also, your trips around Ireland, it's kind of like a little geographical journey around the country and what goes on buses and in cafes and
I don't
those
drive,
places.
so I took a lot of
Me neither, here we go. So tell us first of all, what inspired you to write the book, and then what it was like talking to all of these people.
I started it in 2017, which I think was a pretty pivotal year in Ireland. It was a few years after marriage equality, when that very difficult question about who gets to be a family was raised by people opposed to marriage equality, and there was a real backlash against that, where people started speaking out and saying, you know, I was raised by a single mother and we're just as much a family, even if the state denied us equal rights for so long. I was born in 1988 out of wedlock, and it was only months after the status of illegitimacy was actually abolished, only in 1987. And the report, for all its flaws, did call that an egregious breach of human rights, that status of illegitimacy went on for so long and impacted so many families, not only just in the institutions, but beyond as well. So we were also looking ahead to the repeal referendum that year, and people were sharing their stories and breaking silences about how church and state had treated women and children in this country. And I started speaking with survivors, with people who had first-hand experiences of these institutions. I'm from Dublin, I grew up in Ireland, and would have known vaguely about the Magdalen Laundries and the institutions, but wasn't aware that this was such an urgent issue that was affecting so many people's lives and the lives of people I knew. As soon as I started speaking to people, I found out that friends of mine had been affected. A friend of mine, her mother was adopted through the institutions. Her aunt had actually been sent to an institution in Dublin the same year I was born, in '88. Managed to keep her son. She was actually adopted herself. Kept her son, brought him up in a garage off the side of a house with only a cinder block for a chair at one stage, because her adoptive family essentially disowned her when she became pregnant outside of marriage. And this was in 1988. She raised her son wonderful, but even I think when he was a toddler, her mother turned around to her and said, you know, it's not too late to give him back. So, you know, this was so pervasive, the shame and the silence went on for so long. And I think when I started speaking to people, I realized that this was affecting people my own age, people younger than me. Bessborough only closed in 1998. And through writing Republic of Shame, I found there was an institution in Donegal called the Castle, which there was very little about it that I could find. So I went up to Newtown Cunningham, the small town near the border, and knocked on some doors and spoke to the woman who actually ran the place. And it turned out that it had operated until 2006. It only opened in the 80s and was still open in 2006. So this is something that could have affected my own life. And that institution was very closely working with anti-abortion crisis pregnancy agencies set up by Catholic bishops, because that's who you want running a crisis pregnancy agency. Cura was the name of one of these agencies,
right,
and only ceased operating actually in 2018 when repeal was voted through by a landslide and the Pope visited. So it was interesting to read the report, because that was one of the few institutions that I could FOI documents for, because it came after this kind of cutoff date that they set. And it was interesting to compare and to see what I had in the records and what the Commission had focused on. And there was a real sort of sense of spin, where they were trying to sort of balance positive stories against what I could see from the records. They didn't really mention that it only closed down because the institution was in such disrepair. There was a hole in the roof, and there were sort of hazards. And there was talk about moving it to a new place and hope that Cura would continue to run it. So similar to Tuam, where it closed down not because there was an outcry, even when the state knew the rates of death in that institution, but because they didn't want to spend the money to actually make it safe for women and children. It was described as a fire trap at the time. So, it was really important to both speak with people about their own living experiences, but also, access documents.
And you did. Your archival research was tremendous. I mean, you got into diocesan archives, which are a fantastic source for all kinds of things, if you can get to see them. I mean, again, the overshadowing issue here, and I know Maeve has a passion about this as much as I do, is the church records are private records. They are not covered by any archival legislation in this country. They can do whatever they like with them. Since the church, the Catholic Church in Ireland, from basically the mid-19th century, operated as an arm of the state, our argument would be that they should be public records and covered by the National Archives Act and made available 30 years after the creation, as all state records are. But I think we're a long way off convincing the powers that be that that's what should happen. I'm just conscious of time here. Thanks, Kelan. That was really illuminating. What I'm going to do is quickly go around all four of you and say what you would like to happen now. Would you like to, I presume you don't want the report to stand, any of us here. Is there some way of partially keeping it and repudiating some of it, or should the whole thing go down? That's really the question. In Maeve's case, I think she has explained to us that the most important issue going forward is the right to identity and health and contextual information, which Noelle has been seeking so valiantly for so long. And I think she's told us how that can happen, hopefully. But it's still not, it's a fraught path, am I right? I mean, we're not looking about an instant solution here in any way. So just quickly to do that, and then we'll have about 5 minutes for Q&A. Do we have a microphone somewhere there if we want to do that? Our gentleman here in the front. So, Conall, maybe what do you see happening about this report that would be good?
Well, I think the first and foremost, I think the report is dead in any serious person's mind. I think it was dead within 24 hours. So I think the public reaction to it was really instructive, and I think quite concerning for the government, because there is a way that we do things, there's a way that we investigate state abuses, and it's always done this way. So if the report served any purpose, I think that way is now gone. I don't think they'll be able to do a report in the same manner, as in set up a commission that goes silent for 6 years, produces a report and then disappears. I don't think that's going to happen again. I don't think it can. So that's a positive aspect to it. But I think what happens now is the important thing. And I think, I mean, it's very easy. You ask the people who are affected by this issue what they want, and you give it to them. And to me, it's been really simple. I mean, it's access to records. It's access to ownership of their own experiences. and let them do with that material what they like. It's their material. You know, there's so much talk about privacy and rights, and we need to have concern for the people that were impacted by them. But I mean, nothing to do with this issue was ever about granting rights or granting privacy to women. It was about removing rights from women. So to me, it's very simple. I remember many years ago asking Minister, I think it was Francis Fitzgerald on the plinth in the Dáil, and I said, you know, again, there was a general gaggle of reporters, and I had asked about information and tracing plans. This is, I don't know what iteration of information and tracing was planned at this time. And the answer I got was, oh, well, it's very difficult to legislate for. It's a very complex area. And again, it's the constant thing you have to say, but that is your job.
Exactly.
You're a legislator. That is why you're elected. You're not elected so people in your local constituency can go up to you and ask you about, you know, fixing potholes or whatever. You're in the Dáil to legislate, to make law.
There's an entire Attorney General's office packed with parliamentary glassmen who are supposed to be doing this.
Again, and as someone, one of the survivors said, you know, the whole process was supposed to be nothing about us without us, and it's turned out to be the exact opposite of that experience. And just very quickly, it just struck me when you were talking about, you know, what is the attitude of civil servants? And the only reason I took my phone out was to look this up. I wasn't.
You're allowed. It's okay. It's research. It's research.
I got a letter from a civil servant in the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, and it was anonymous, but I have a suspicion I may know who it is, but this just gives you the attitude. Dear Conall, congratulations on your work on Tuam, etc. The lamentable view from within the DCYA is, 1, sure, they'd have died in the tenements anyway. 2, they're only after redress. 3, grandiosely, we're the department of the future, not the past. This is held at the most senior levels. Tuam is like the World Trade Center, seriously, that's a quote, too costly and complex to investigate. On the same theme, you'd be digging up half the country. It is interesting the extent to which civil servants who had no involvement in the original wrongdoing default to an extreme defensiveness and compound and aggravate it. The same sentiments applied to falsified birth certificates and proper disclosure of records. The minister is well-meaning but credulous and inexperienced. If left to her officials, progress will be made in the most grudging and glacial way possible, if at all. Please do not circulate this document. It is intended for you alone to give you some sense of the wall of cynicism you are up against. Contents, of course, can be shared if of any use, which I've deemed that they are.
You're all very honoured today to have this very illuminating
Forgive
document
anonymity, but needs must. Good luck, we're running out of road. You cannot be faulted, but momentum is draining. So, I mean, that is the attitude
that
within
is
the
shattering,
DCYA.
you know, it's just...
And to give you one other small example, I did an FOI many years ago about Bessborough, and the FOI officer contacted me to meet her, which never happens, to just discuss the records, to get a sense of what I wanted and what way she could facilitate the release of the records. So I went up and I met her, and out of just pure curiosity, I said, where are the records for Bessborough held? So she said, I'll show you the building. So we went outside, this is in Sarsfield's Court in Cork, and we walked up to this nondescript building. And there was I was not going in there, I was not going to view any of the records, but she's like, yeah, they're just in there in boxes, basically. And she was trying to outline to me the difficulty of putting together FOIs from material like this, where you've just got to go through it. Sure. And her manager came running out the door, and a full-blown row ensued between her manager and herself about me being on the premises at all in the first place, and that they had been notified from Dublin, we were in Cork, that a journalist, and me in particular, was on the property, and heaven forbid, like, I would, access something or whatever.
Radioactive person.
But again, it just gives you the scale of secrecy that was involved in this, and this was a very professional, normal conversation. I remember at the time going, Jesus Christ, like, this is insane. You know what I mean? This is how this place operates. So, yeah, I wanted to get those across because
you're dead right. And I think one of the most interesting things we've learned today is what you read out to us this morning, just now. That, the questions we were asking earlier about mindset. How does this work within the powerful institutions that have control now, which are the state now, rather than the church, who have control of all this information? That is the way they think. Have you published that, by the way?
I did on my blog, yeah. I didn't put it in the paper at the time.
We might try and put it on the website of the festival so that the whole world can have a look at it.
Yeah, I've put it out on Twitter a few times.
Okay, well, let's go
I
again.
think the interesting thing is I think governments come and go, but civil servants stay.
Oh,
and
yeah.
cultures remain. And I think there's a major cultural shift that needs to happen at those levels
Yeah,
before
I think
this
that's absolutely
gets
right.
anywhere.
Thanks, Conall. That was illuminating. Kelan, what would you like to happen in the aftermath of the report?
I think there are going to be, I mean, the current institutional systems that we're seeing today and that we're repeating the same mistakes with direct provision, with emergency accommodation. There are going to be future investigations into systems like this. And I think if we've learned anything, it is that we have to put survivors first. We have to listen to survivors. They are the experts of their own experience. And what summed up the report for me was the day that it was released, they held a private webinar for survivors and people affected. And I stood in the front garden in Dublin of an 82-year-old woman who had been sent to Tuam twice and had 2 children taken from her through Tuam. And then she was sent as a multiple offender to the Magdalen Laundry in Galway, which is just not too far from here. And incarcerated. She managed to escape over the wall. The guards came after her, but she had a fierce dog back at the farm and her siblings were there and made sure she wasn't taken away. And she's a fantastic woman, Rose. She's incredibly strong. But we had to stand in her front garden and I had to set up a laptop under lockdown with masks, trying to sanitize everything so that she could watch this, because no one thought that survivors might need access to this webinar. No one was actually thinking about the people affected. And I remember watching this woman having to stand in her front garden in front of all her neighbours, you know, and watch people in power, you know, they told her to read the report carefully. They said, now, before we do this big grand state apology tomorrow, which was rushed through, you should read the report carefully
3,000
to decide
pages.
whether you want to accept this apology. She couldn't even get a copy of the report.
No, she couldn't.
They didn't even send out a physical
Shambles.
copy of the report to survivors. And so how was she meant to read it? You know, she couldn't even access the webinar. So, you know, and I just remember her daughter standing behind her in tears and fury, wondering why they weren't talking about Tuam. Why weren't we? It's more than 3 years after the state promised action that they would do a full forensic exhumation of Tuam. Still nothing has been done. There's still families waiting to try to identify their loved ones and get some closure.
And as Catherine Corris, whom you were interviewing this morning, who wanted to be here today but can't because she's publicising her new memoir, which is a remarkable book, but she continually asks the question, what's the difference between the bones of those children and bones that are found in the course of archaeological investigations, all of which are treated with immense respect, exhumed, identified if possible, and reburied? What's the difference? And that answer, there's no answer to that question as yet. Thank you, Kelan. We're a bit short of time, so it's really...
Sure, very quickly
if
then.
you can be brief so I can give you a little bit of chance.
The Commission investigation report to be scrapped, obviously it cannot stand as a history of 76 years of those institutions. Significantly, and I was thinking about this morning, the testimonies, if all those recordings are gathered,
Yeah.
they are the exact testimonies of what went on that day, which would form a very good archive around something to be salvaged from the report, not to be transcribed by anybody in the state agencies, but an independent agency as an archive. That the information and tracing bill is resurrected out of the long grass, but not the version that the Adoption Rights Alliance and the Clann Project sent to the Minister, that version of the bill is passed through and that we are granted rights to our birth information, our medical records and our birth certificates, our basic human rights.
Absolutely. Maeve.
Thanks, Noelle and Catriona. And actually, it's worth saying, yeah, we, in the Clann Project with other academics and also with people directly affected, of course, did send a draft bill to the government in 2019. And one of the things that the current bill doesn't include, as well as my other list of problems, is no rights for mothers to the information and no rights to the for the family members of the deceased, and the burial bill in relation to Tuam, which proposes to disapply the coroner wherever the state chooses to dig, also has no rights to information in it for relatives. Just the question of what should happen now, I hope you don't mind if I just mention that. 2 days ago, my colleagues now in Justice for Magdalen's Research published a book that basically sums up the 12 years of work
Hold it
on
up so that it can be filmed.
Magdalen laundries. And of course, you know, brings in these questions of what now, and the last chapter in particular goes to that issue of needing access to records and memorialisation that involves public education. Of course, access to records primarily and first and foremost for those affected, and then public access and permanent preservation. We've done a lot of work in relation to stopping the sale of the Sean McDermott Street Magdalen site, the 2 acres there, to a Japanese budget hotel chain, which Dublin City Council wanted to do for €14 million in 2018. The National Museum of Ireland is also working to salvage the contents of the Donnybrook Magdalen site, even though that has been sold to developers. Of course, you know, the institutions overlap, and there is a need, bearing in mind immediate needs for personal and family access, there is also a need to gather together what's gone wrong and what needs to change around transparency and the education of young people in relation to the industrial schools, the reformatory schools, the Magdalen laundries, the mother and baby homes, forced family separation. It all is related. The inquests are needed. Families are looking for inquests. And the burial, I mean, I just find it actually gaslighting, these bills. Yeah. There is a coroner. The coroner is able to exhume where necessary. The coroner is already also able to have investigations where it's impossible to recover a body. We don't actually need legislation, just like the GDPR already is there to provide people access to their personal data. What is the need for this legislation that does away with all of that? It's absolutely baffling. And then I hope that Mary's court case, along with Philomena Lee, which are the 2 that will be heard out of 8 in November, that they go well, of course, and that the government puts a notice on the front of the report saying we have not accepted its findings due to concerns with the methodologies. Mary and Philomena's argument is that Section 34 of the Commissions of Investigation Act 2004 says that wherever a person is identifiable from the report, even if not named, they must receive a draft of the report in order to make comments. And had they received it, they would have commented that the findings did not take into account their evidence, their sworn affidavit evidence, for example. And of course, the Commission respected the rights to fair procedures of all the alleged wrongdoers and sent, we knew from Mary Daly giving her talk in Oxford, they sent all of the documents to the religious, the administrative records they gathered to ask for their comments, and they did not do that with, as far as we know, a single person.
Let's hope we get the right judge, which I know I shouldn't say, but you know, it is a factor. But those 2 cases are very, very important and high profile, and again, will focus back public attention on the issue of the report in the mother and baby homes. I'm sure you're getting the sense we could talk for hours, which we really could, about this, that every single one of our panel has many, many things to say, and if we went on for hours and hours, and we could, you'd learn lots more stuff, but time is against us. Alex, do we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions? Is that a yes? Good man, thank you. Okay, so 1 or 2 questions, and then we can let you all go off and have your lunch. Would anyone like to start the ball rolling? Somebody up here, great, thank you.
Just to introduce myself, I was a social worker for 38 years in Galway and the West, and came across many victims, survivors of St. Mary's Tomb, some Castle Pollard. Your last question was very interesting. Since I retired, I obviously have kept up my friendships with the survivors of Tomb. Unfortunately, we buried one about 2.5 weeks ago. Well, I don't want this as a criticism. I want it as an addition to the conversation. Access to records and all of that, very important, essential. I work with survivors today. A survivor who cannot get a hearing aid, and if the phone rings, he doesn't hear it. A survivor whose one room locked in their house because the county council deemed it a dangerous building. Another survivor trying to get house repairs. I can go on. My point is, everything that you've said is correct, and I agree with everything of it. But I can tell you from the survivors that I meet, they have 2 big fears. If you continue to try to repudiate this report, they will not get access to the finance they need, and I don't like the word redress. These people need money to make themselves comfortable in their later years. They're well able to do it themselves if they have the wherewithal to do it. And I would ask you, that's all I'm saying, I'm asking you, when you talk about rights, please remember there are people, and I call them, what Kelan talks about, I call them the non-Zoomies, because some of them don't even have a phone. If they have a mobile phone, it's a Nokia. They don't have smartphones. And there's all these Zoom calls, and it's wonderful that this is going out wherever it's going out. But my commitment is to the people who live in isolated rural areas and who don't have access, who have no cars. One man, in 1 week in July, I brought to 3 different appointments. One for his diabetes, for his eyes, second for his heart pacemaker, and the third for his hearing aid. So I would like to introduce that into the discussion. We're talking about real people with real problems. And I'll finish up then on the Coroner's Act. We had a meeting on Monday. They are equally traumatized that if there is this pressure for a new Coroner's Act, the exhumations will be held up until this new act comes in. And we've already heard how long it takes to get legislation through, even though we can see that at the end of the term they can put through 9 bills for poor Michael D to sweat it out. So I'm just making a plea that, along with all the other good things and everything that you've said is absolutely correct, and I agree with it, please remember and maybe talk a little bit more to the non-Zoomie survivors.
That's a very good point. Thank you, sir, for that very comprehensive intervention. We didn't get to talk about that charged word, redress. Maeve and her colleagues have been looking at this quite seriously, but I think it's important to say redress does not depend on the recommendations of the report. It can be done any time, as I understand it. It's not, I mean, this has been argued by lawyers, that the government can set up a redress scheme any time it likes. It's not dependent on the conclusions reached by the report of the Commission of Investigation. Maeve, maybe you'll go to that.
Very briefly, I'd love to come in. And actually the government could have set up a payment system at the very beginning, and it absolutely should do that in future. Because it's always ex gratia, it's never in recognition of wrongdoing. And what I would say, I mean, I've been very involved in making all kinds of recommendations, including everything you're saying about redress. And the government is due to come out with its recommendations. I mean, the Mother and Baby Homes Commission left out a lot of people who deserve payments too, didn't make recommendations regarding boarded out children, had very strange cut-offs in relation to mothers. But when Conall said the report is dead, I actually wouldn't agree, because our experience with the Magdalene Laundries McAleese report was that the civil servants used that and still continue to use it to say that the women are not actually telling the truth, so that when there are no records to say they were in an institution, we had to get an ombudsman's investigation that then found there'd been maladministration because the Department of Justice refused to accept the women's own testimony as having any evidentiary value. And that goes back to the big sign on the front of the Confidential Committee's report, on top of 550 people's testimony saying some of this is contaminated because people were meeting up in groups and they got stuff off the TV. So there is an issue when it comes to the civil service who will be administering. And it's up to all of us who understand all the complexities to continue to push for the redress and to continue to monitor how it's being administered. There are some good recommendations in the report, but the overall lesson it gives to the civil servants is that people are lying.
Yeah.
And that they don't actually deserve it. And in relation to the exhumations, my point is that the exhumations don't need legislation. So again, it's the government is dividing and conquering, and there are some people who want inquests. And its legislation is saying if we're going near Tuam, the coroner is having nothing to do with Tuam. So they are dividing the survivors. Peter Mulryan's family wants an inquest. They have a right to one. There also is a right to everybody to have their family members exhumed, and if they don't want an inquest, that's fine. But the government is messing with everybody's heads. It's messing with the law, it's messing with our democratic institutions. We are actually a so-called democracy with existing justice mechanisms. And it's really, I think, it has done this for decades, plays people off each other, looks for the one group or the one person who wants something different and then says, look, we can't. It's really complex. I really welcome your intervention so much. It's really important.
And Maeve, what you're saying about access to records for redress, the woman I mentioned who's non-Zoomy, who had to watch this webinar in her front garden, Rose, to access her records, and it's so important for applying for redress, when I worked with her to try and access those, and there's no one-stop shop to go to. We had to call around several different centres. As a journalist, it was challenging to get access to those records. But she had to apply to the same order of nuns that incarcerated her in a Magdalen laundry to access her records from the time that she spent, as a Magdalen survivor. And we got one line from a ledger back that actually proved that the nuns had sent her from Tuam to the Magdalen laundry, and under cause it was written twice penitent. So because she had had 2 children. And that was a key document for her to have, but the religious order that incarcerated her was still in control of that record.
Tells you how circular it all is. Folks, it's 12:45, which is 15 minutes over the time we were allocated. I should have been more disciplined as chair, but everything these 4 people have to say is fascinating and useful to you. We'll have to call a halt now because our people here have to get prepared for the next gig. Thank you all for coming. I hope you learned something from these brilliant, passionate people who have been advocating on behalf of survivors for so long, and one of whom is, of course, one of our most eminent survivors and most expressive of it. Could you please thank Conall O'Fatharta, Caelainn Hogan, Noelle Brown, and Maeve O'Rourke.